everybody that you're going to be much more successful at that now. You're the data.
Sounds good. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started with the first roundtable? If I can have folks take your seat. It's an honor and privilege to be here today as Idaho State Forester. My name is David Groeschl. I can't think of a topic that's more relevant, at least to me, with forest and rangeland management here in Idaho and many of the impacts that those have here on all of us. It's my pleasure to have worked with many of the panel members that are here today, as well as many of you in the audience, regarding many of the issues here that we face. We're here, I think as you heard, forest and rangeland touch pretty much all of our lives here in one way or another, environmentally, recreationally, economically, you name it. And as state forester, I have to wear many hats, both from a management standpoint, but also from a protection standpoint, as the governor pointed out, where we protect 6.3 million acres of state and private forest lands from wildfire. And the topic today that's before us, National Forest and Rangeland Management, I think we're here for a reason. We're here because we see an issue or a problem looming. And that's when we come together, coalesce together to find solutions for the challenges that lay before us. And so the first panel today is really to kind of set the stage for, on the forest side, what are some of the forest management challenges that we face here in Idaho. And some of the other panels will talk about some of the challenges facing rangelands. And some of the subsequent panels after that, then we'll talk a little bit about what are some of the tools and solutions that we're using to address some of those challenges. So with us today on the panel is Mr. Boeh with Idaho Forest Group, Whelan with the Nature Conservancy, and Shawn, Executive Director of the Associated Logging Contractors. Before the panelists give their perspective on the forest management challenges here in Idaho, I thought I'd just set the stage here a little bit for context purposes. So the first piece is just the ownership of the forests here in Idaho. 41% of the landscape here in Idaho is covered by forests. Of that 41% of the landscape, as you could see from the pie chart, 75% of that is federal forest land. The bulk of being National Forest Service lands, is system lands, as well as BLM forested property. There's 5% of that is endowment trust land, 5% that is other state land, such as Park and Recs, Fish and Game, Idaho Transportation Department. And then we have about 10% that is what we call private, and that includes forested agricultural type of lands, rangelands, as well as tribal lands here in Idaho, and non-industrial forest landowners. So there's a mix there in that. And it's hard to have a discussion about any topic where you look at the significant impact of federal lands, forest lands here in Idaho. Next slide. So I kind of wanted to paint the picture of the scale and the magnitude of the issues prior to the panel members talking. So to give you an idea, here in Idaho, 20.4 million acres is federal forest land here in Idaho. When the 2014 Farm Bill was passed, the governors of each state were asked to, within 60 days of passing the Farm Bill, were asked to identify those lands on federal lands that were at high risk of insect and disease mortality. And that was either currently experiencing a high level of forest decline due to insect and disease, or was projected within the next 15 years under the Farm Bill language to experience significant forest decline within that 15-year period. So as you could, we went past a little bit, but what we looked at was the insect and disease, if you will. When you look at the map, we excluded the wilderness area as well as the roadless areas. That left us with about 12.6 million acres of federal lands, National Forest System lands here in Idaho, that had a classification suitable for some level of management. So then we overlaid the National Insect and Disease map on top of that, as per the criteria under the Farm Bill, in order to start getting a handle on the magnitude of the issue here in Idaho. And of the 12.6 million acres, 8.8 million acres of that was identified as at high risk, either currently experiencing significant forest decline or would be experiencing forest decline in the next 15 years. So that's 8.8 million acres. That represents about 2/3 of the 12.6 million acres that was classified as suitable for some level of management. So of the 8.8 million acres then is where we rolled up our sleeves and started working with the collaboratives and the forest supervisors on every forest here in Idaho after passage of the 2014 Farm Bill, because we knew we only had 60 days to identify those proposed treatment designations under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. So as we worked with the collaboratives here, the existing collaboratives and the forest supervisors, of the 8.8 million acres, we identified 50 proposed treatment areas across the state, totaling 1.8 million acres. So next. And that's what you see here. The blue represents the 50 proposed treatment areas. That totals 1.8 million acres. That was just our initial effort. Those are the proposed treatment areas under HEFRA, where there was agreement by the local collaboratives, agreement by the Forest Service, and this was bubbled up from the ground up. This was not a top-down exercise where the Department of Lands identified these areas for these proposed treatment areas. This is where there was already local support and agreement with the collaboratives and the Forest Service. Now, there are areas definitely outside of that also fit that criteria, but this was the initial starting point. These were the 50 proposed treatment areas that Governor Otter submitted to the Secretary as per the requirements under the 2014 Farm Bill. They were all accepted by the Secretary, and so work has begun on those 50 proposed treatment areas using a variety of authorities. The Forest Service has been working diligently to try to use all the tools in the tool bag to try to address those areas. That is the scale, though, and magnitude of it, and that's part of why we're here today. So given the scale and magnitude of that, then our panelists will be asked to provide from their perspective, what do they see as the challenges in addressing the scale and magnitude of the issue here in Idaho? So we will start with Mr. Bob Boeh.
Thank you, David. This is actually a rectangular table, not a round table, in case you hadn't noticed, which is very important to us at IFG because that's what we do. We make rectangles out of circular logs. So with that, I'm going to talk about 6 challenges that I see, which gives me less than a minute for each challenge. So I'll have to get with it. The first one is funding wildfire costs. There's actually 2 parts to that issue. The first part is funding fighting fires like we do other natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and the like. The second aspect is cost containment. And that gets into, we want to make sure that we're effective and efficient in fighting fires. And the best way to do that is to control the fuel load on the ground. That's one thing that we have within our power is control the fuel loads, and we do that through active management. The second issue is increasing the pace and scale of restoration. We hear about that a lot, but what I think we need to do is we need a baseline for where we're at, and we need a future goal of where we want to get to. And why that's important is because the governors of Montana and Idaho have identified 6.7 million acres that need treatment. So if we did 67,000 acres a year, which is significantly more than we're doing right now, that would take us a century to complete. And by the end of that century, there'd be millions of other acres that are in need of treatment. The third challenge is litigation and conflict resolution. The litigation only benefits the attorneys. It doesn't benefit the professionals and the collaborators. So we like the concept of what we call baseball arbitration. What baseball arbitration requires is each party has to come up with an alternative that they will agree to. And then this is given to an arbitrator, and he has to pick one or the other. He can't mediate the conflict. So that forces people to be reasonable, and we think it will bring people to the table. And it worked very well in the baseball field. If you don't like that concept, there's another concept called medical mediation. In most states, there's a medical panel that before you can file a malpractice lawsuit, you have to present your case to this medical panel, and then they'll tell you your chances of victory. And this isn't binding and doesn't prohibit you from filing a lawsuit, but what it does do is it makes people be reasonable and hopefully prohibits some frivolous lawsuits. The fourth issue is addressing all stakeholder interests. And I think we need to do a better job of involving the tribes, the ATVers, the snowmobilers. And the other thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the national groups as well as the local chapters are represented, because sometimes we reach agreement with a local chapter and they're fine with the proposal. Then it gets back to Washington, D.C. and for political reasons or whatever, the national groups have an issue with it. So we need to mesh those concerns. The fifth issue is the Idaho roadless rule. There's a number of special places in the state that I think need what I call capital W wilderness protection. One of them happens to be in my backyard, Scotchman Peak in northern Idaho. And in exchange for that, I think what we need is we need to develop a map of the roaded suitable timber base and give those suitable timberlands the same kind of equality of permanence that the wilderness lands gets, so that we can have a total solution and we can move forward with active management of our suitable timber base. The sixth issue is just overall forest health. And if we don't resolve these challenges that I've already listed, then I think we're going to continue to see insect disease, fire, and we won't see communities benefiting from growing and actively managing our timberlands. So the no-cut advocates are killing our forests, and we're glad to be part of this initiative process. We salute the governors and the Western governors and look forward to working with everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Now, Whelan from Nature Conservancy.
Thank you, Dave. And so this is the challenges panel. And this one's kind of hard. Challenges are huge, frustrating, and be a counter. I was really struck by the quality of the folks right here. Many of you I've worked with over the years. We don't always agree, but we've learned how to work together. And then listening to Governor Otter talk about collaboration and having gone all in on the Farm Bill authorities, Craig Foss, Dave Groeschl, his Office of Species Conservation and Fish and Game on sage grouse, and then listening to Jim Lyons, who's got outstanding leaders here in Idaho, and folks like the State Director Tim Murphy, Supervisor Keith Lanham, and Supervisor Cheryl Probert are here from the Forest Service. These are folks who are going to be working together on the solutions to these challenges. So our job here is not to go on at length, but just to emphasize some of the challenges. And I think I made my list from my friend with the timber industry and agree with all of them to some extent. And so I'm really struck by the overlap. So the Nature Conservancy has a nationwide effort called Restoring America's Forest. We're very concerned about the health of forests across the continent and want to see a significant increase in the pace and scale of forest restoration. My role here in Idaho is to do the policy work for the Idaho chapter. A few years ago, Senator Crapo asked Jim Caswell and me to provide staff assistance and advice to the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, so I have that experience. And then I work with some of the folks here in the room on a group called the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership. That's a network for this forest-based collaboratives. And what we have found in those different settings is that there is a fairly broad zone of agreement on what some of the challenges are with our forests and what some of the solutions are. First of all, on the challenge side, it's clear that our forests have changed. We have seen them change before our eyes, particularly here in southern Idaho, but across the state. A history of fire suppression, climate change, development in the wildland-urban interface have all produced conditions in which forests in Idaho are much less resilient to disturbance than they were originally. We went into the Clearwater Basin Collaborative with some scientists and did I think a really revealing study of the forest conditions in that basin. What we did is we compared the modeled historic distribution of vegetation and species types within the Clearwater Basin against what's there today. And we found a significant departure from that historical or natural condition. And that change wouldn't surprise you. It is that the forests have fewer openings, they're denser, the species mix is more shade tolerant species like grand fir. And that type of forest is departed from the conditions that adapted to evolutionary forces like fire, insect, and disease. We looked at just the suitable timber base in the eroded front country of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest and identified about 350,000 acres that would benefit from disturbance-based restoration. That would be some kind of mechanical treatment or controlled fire or fire that would bring more openings and more widely spaced trees. We've begun to look across the state, and although the picture is very mixed, southern versus northern Idaho, we can say that the restoration needs across the state are also huge. And while the agency is making progress towards hazardous fuels reduction and dealing with some of these forest health issues, the pace is not yet where it needs to be. So I was struck by Governor Otter's statement about value. Because when we talk about the zone of agreement, what we're trying to do is knit together some folks that come at this from very different perspectives. Conservation groups like ours that are interested in wildlife and watershed health and streams and the ecology of forest systems, communities that care about jobs, a timber industry that cares about the economic return, and it is not at all incidental to the success of everything else. Have to come together. So the value statement is wildlife, fire resilience, watersheds, economic values, community stability. By working together, we can increase all of those values. How we do this really matters. These are not necessarily simple decisions or programs to put in place, but if we have that zone of agreement, I do believe that we can work, folks in this room and beyond can work together to push this kind of work forward in a meaningful way. There's one administrative challenge that I would point to, and that is the importance of the agency's ability to manage its land base. So I'm looking at a chart of the staff, the FTEs on the two northernmost forests from 2000 to 2015. And it peaked close to 400 and it's now just above 250. We have lost the implementation capacity and are in the process of losing implementation capacity in many of these national forests. And one of the significant reasons for that is the ever escalating cost of wildfire suppression. And so I think it's been mentioned already, a high priority for the Nature Conservancy is to figure out, to push in Congress with the help of our delegation, who have been huge leaders in this, to move the extraordinary costs of the most expensive wildfires to disaster funding and to try to leave the agency budget, to give a break to the agency budget for managing the land. So with that, thank you and look forward to the discussion with you all.
Thank you, Will. Now, Shawn Keough from the Associated Logging Contractors.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Western Governors Association, and appreciate the opportunity to represent the Associated Logging Contractors here today. Many of you are familiar with the ALC, but very quickly, we are the major trade association for logging and wood products hauling contractors in the state of Idaho. We have 450 members that are located across the state, and I like to say wherever the trees are is where you will find our folks. We're multi-generational businesses and family owned, and we've been a fabric of the communities. Several of our members' families have homesteaded Idaho. And so we have a tie to the land, and we have a love for what we do. And that's part of my message here today when I think about challenges to the task ahead and the task that's in front of us is that we are the workforce. We are the folks in the forests that are going to go out and do the work that the professionals tell us need to be done for the work on the ground for restoration. We are the ones that have made the investment of hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars, into the equipment, and we're the ones that are trained to do the work. Our association has a couple of affiliates. We have a safety consulting side of our association, and so we're intimately involved in helping our contractors make sure that their employees get home safely every day. And we also have an insurance side of our association as well. And from the insurance perspective, it's a very challenging time for us. We are consistently rated as a profession that is dangerous in its occupation, dangerous in the work that it does. And there's some business challenges, but more important to our task here today, we are, again, the infrastructure of the backbone of what you all need to do, what we all need to do on the ground to restore our landscapes. I look at the map that David put up here, and in the southeastern portion of our state, in Salmon, Chalice, Bear Lake, those areas, we maybe have 3 or 4 contractors left in that area. Here in southwestern Idaho, with the recent change in ownership of 180,000 acres or so of private forest land, we are at a tipping point with we have about 40 businesses in that area. About 8 to 12 of those are core logging contractors. Those folks are making decisions today as to whether or not they are still going to be in business shortly. We've already lost a couple of them. We are doing better in the northern part of the state, but I would say that time is of the essence. It's of the essence for our land. When you take a look at the treatment areas that David outlined and the high risk of disease and wildfire, Time is of the essence for our infrastructure. Our businesses and the people in them stand ready to do this work. We're anxious to continue to be in business, and we want to do our part. But again, I would say time is of the essence. And then lastly, I would say that many of our members have been involved and are involved in the collaboratives across the state. It would seem to us that the hard work that's done by those members, the diverse members of those collaboratives, and the hard work that's done by federal agencies, that work needs to be respected. And while there is a role to be played by the general public, we need to not allow the work of those folks to be fodder for serial litigators. And those are the challenges that we at the Associated Logging Contractors see. And again, we stand ready to be part of this dialogue and continue to do the day-to-day work that's needed to restore our forests. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you to our panel members for giving their perspective on the challenges, forest management challenges here in Idaho. The goal of this panel and all the panels today and tomorrow is to generate discussion, dialogue with all of you out there. And it's to get that dialogue going. So there are a couple of folks with mics that'll rove around. So what we would like to do at this point is open it up for question and answer period. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, please raise your hand and one of the folks with the mic will bring the mic to you. Mr. Harrington.
I was going to wait for somebody else. Bob Harrington, I'm the Montana State Forester. I'm somewhat Dave's counterpart over there. Thank you for those messages. Thanks for this great opportunity for the discussion, because I think that's the powerful side of this. I think most of us know the story of the spotted owl, what that did for the forestry community in the Northwest. We know what we've been working on with sage grouse and the tremendous effort that's been going on to prevent that from having widespread impacts on all the stakeholders. And now we have the issue of lynx and the recent refusal of the Supreme Court to consider the Cottonwood decision. I'm wondering if any of you would care to comment on the potential that has to derail a lot of the efforts that I think we're talking about relative to federal forest management.
I will step dangerously into the breach. The Nature Conservancy doesn't litigate, so I'm not going to address so much the Cottonwood decision, although that will certainly be a challenge. But going back to the spotted owl, I think that part of it is how we frame this issue as conservationists and as leaders. It's easy, thinking back on the history of conservation, to define no action as the environmentally preferable outcome. And I think it's important that we frame in this forest health arena the costs of no action, because these forests are changing. If we take no action, they will continue to change in ways that will have and have had a significant environmental effect. So I think it is important for those of us who work in this area to define a future that involves active management, use of natural and controlled burns, to achieve outcomes that are defined as the environmentally preferable situation. I'm working off the spotted owl because there the spotted owl was considered no touch was the outcome you wanted. And for Idaho forest health and our watershed health, the no touch approach is not the environmentally preferable approach.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for that. My name is Brenda Richards, and first and foremost, I'm a family rancher from Owyhee County. I have served as I'm immediate past president of the Public Lands Council, represent the Idaho Association of Counties for the Western Interstate region and have worked on the Owyhee Initiative for over 15 years. So I have a huge passion for these kinds of questions. I would like to direct that because, as you can tell, I have more of a rangeland aspect, but we share one of the same concerns that forest collaboration shares. And Bob, you addressed it. When we get something moving forward on a local level and we have buy-in, whether it's from a community standpoint, county standpoint, or maybe a state, and then we get to the national level, and all of that enthusiasm and planning and everything can get kiboshed. Sometimes it's rules and regulations, but sometimes it's dues paying, philosophy-based aspects. Do you have any thoughts on how you would address it? Because the tribes and associations at a national level bring a different challenge for both of us. I'd be interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think, everything starts locally, so you got to get that agreement locally, and then you just need to develop your collaboratives and your partnerships and take that argument forward and work together, and you need to stick together all the way to Washington, D.C. and try to get it done. That's what we're doing on the wilderness issue on Scotchman Peaks.
Any other?
Hi, thanks a lot for your comments. A question, I guess it would maybe directed toward Will initially, but for the whole group. You've identified on the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, you've identified a zone of agreement within which you can work. And I guess if you could comment a little bit more about the likelihood of actually seeing active management and how much of that ground you think that might occur on. And then I guess I'm also interested from an ALC perspective. What is there a threshold for volume needed in order to continue to sustain some of those businesses that are right on the cusp of closing doors?
Okay, well, I'll take a shot at that first part. So I'm carrying with me the 5-year report of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative's achievements. If you're interested, come see me. It's actually been pretty impressive in terms of the number of jobs created and acres treated. Not enough. So we'd like to see more. And the kind of conversation that we will press forward with the Clearwater Basin Collaborative is to look at the landscape scale and think about the pace of restoration in terms of a decadal pace that will address these forest health departures, and state what that is. They're undergoing a forest planning process, and there's been a really rich conversation with the Forest Service about how it is that we take these landscape scale objectives and state them in a way that the communities can understand, and over time hold themselves and the agency accountable to those objectives. So I see great progress. I see frustrations. A major project in the CBC area was just pulled to redo some of the analysis after some litigation. So the road has been productive, but it had some bumps in it too. So in terms of thresholds, I know there's been a recent mill closure up in Orfino. So there's lots of concerns, but I'll turn to Bob. He knows a lot more about that, or Senator Keough.
Well, thank you for the question. I wish I had the data to answer your question, but I don't, although we are working with the College of Natural Resources at the University of Idaho as an association to better quantify that. Our contractors, typically, the farthest out they can see is the next year. We have worked with our partners on the mill side for longer term contracts, and I would say that extends also to any work, whether it's the state or the federal agencies, and the multi-year stewardship projects, as an example, are helpful to our contractors, because then we can see some long-term activity and plan around that accordingly with our bankers, especially, and with our crews, and be able to let our crews know that we have some work out a few years. So anytime you can do that is beneficial. I can tell you what's challenging is to have, Will mentioned Orofino and the closure of the Tri-Pro mill there, and then the closure of the Blue North mill in Keough. What is challenging for our contractors, and there's been a couple of other occasions in the north as well, is to have an injunction filed on a sale that's been sold, and contractors that were prepared to go to work, in some cases the next week, all of a sudden do not have that work and don't have anything else in front of them, and that's hugely disruptive and makes it very much of a challenge to continue to operate. And for some folks, particularly in this day and age, that ends up being the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak.
Can I say one thing about litigation? Because we pointed out there's been some issues, but there was also a recent victory for the Pay It Forest Coalition on a challenge to a major timber sale, the Lost Creek, Boulder Creek. And, you know, the final court opinion is one of those snoozers, highly technical legal analysis. But there was an earlier decision denying a temporary restraining order filed by the plaintiffs, where Judge Lodge said something really interesting. At that stage, when you're looking at injunctions, you balance the public interest. And Judge Lodge said that he found that the public interest in this case was to return the forest closer to its historic condition, that providing the economic benefits of the project was also in the public interest. And interestingly, the presence of a collaborative, the Pay It Forest Coalition, having designed the project, was another factor he would weigh in denying the injunction. So, you know, wow, in a single paragraph, he stated kind of the target I would like to see for the future of forest management in Idaho, and it's great to see a judge recognize those factors in making a decision.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, stealing a little bit from what David said at a prior meeting, is we import 200 million board feet from adjacent states and provinces. So the first goal ought to be to get that volume produced here in the state of Idaho so that we create those jobs for our logging contractors and others.
And we'll make David the last question, but I want to ask one really quick. How many operating mills do you have in Idaho right now?
Well, we have 5.
5. Is that the total?
No, that's the total for Idaho Forest Group. I don't know how many total mills are.
Probably in the neighborhood, I'd have to get the directory. When you're looking at the combination of different mills, sawmills, pulp mills, post and pull, you're probably in the neighborhood of about 40 to 50 types of businesses related to forest products.
I think in Colorado, there's one right now that's actually running. Is that right? Yeah. So you're doing way better than they are. Last one.
This is a capacity question that you mentioned, Will, and you and I talked very briefly about it before, but it's the numbers that you were pointing out, and I'm in Washington, D.C., and I see the total Forest Service numbers of FTEs, and it's kind of flat. So I wondered if you'd explain that more specifically, and then if the other panelists have comments as well on the capacity challenge that you pointed out.
So this is the part of the Forest Service is managing land, and the part of the Forest Service is managing fire. That's the question. And we've seen this really dramatic shift over the last few decades. In 1995, it was 16% of the agency's budget going to fire suppression. Last year was 52%. In 10 years, 2025, it's expected to be around 67%. And the agency's overall budget's not going up at that rate. And so what you see is, you got the green shirts and the yellow shirts, right? The land and the fire. And that that green shirt person was a giant dude, woman 20 years ago, and that person's getting smaller, and the yellow shirt is getting bigger. And this is not, this is hard stuff, right? This is way deeply embedded in an agency that's got lots of line items in its budgets. And it's not just that size of the budget, but it's also the practice of fire borrowing. So in many years, we budget to the 10-year average on fire, right? So the agency's budget appropriate is typically the 10-year average. And that works okay if the 10-year average is staying the same, but it's not, it's tipping up because fires are getting bigger, hotter for a variety of reasons. And so in many years where you exceed the appropriated amount and your actual suppression costs, the agency has to go out and make up that shortfall. And Congress then has to come back and clean up the mess. That makes it hard. It is very subtle level in the line agency, line officer decision-making about how they appropriate resources to the ground for things like fuels management. And so we need to fix fire borrowing, and we also need to think about how we deal with this ever-escalating 10-year average and its hollowing out of the agency's ability to implement projects on the ground across all resources, wildlife, recreation, and forest restoration.
And I would just add that from the ALC has been very actively partnering with our peer groups in Washington, D.C. to try to address this issue of the consumption of the Forest Service budget for firefighting. And we are advocates for moving that off of the Forest Service so that they can get back to what we feel is the focus of the agency, and that's managing the lands and not managing the firefighting force of the country. And so what we see is that it diminishes the ability of the Forest Service to do the other work that they have to do. And that's very concerning to us. It postpones everything in it, and the nature of fire is erratic, of course, and it's not something you can plan for, and it really does bring to a halt any other type of work that might have been contemplated for that season. And that's frustrating for them and frustrating for those of us that need the work to get done.
Yeah, I would just add, that's why we stepped up to Good Neighbor Authority and put some money in the pot, because we don't see more money going to the Forest Service, and we know that the work needs to get done. So we were willing to prime the pump to get Good Neighbor Authority going. And I think that program has great promise. I agree with all the firefighting stuff too, but I think Good Neighbor will be able to be a little more efficient, save some dollars, and get more work done.
So I'll wrap this up and try to summarize quickly some of the challenges here that I heard. So everybody has seen the magnitude of what we're facing here. Will articulated it in the departure from historic conditions out on the landscape. And here are the challenges in trying to address the magnitude and scale of the issue that faces us. So I heard start with workforce, the folks on the ground, and the challenges of having a workforce in place to actually handle the management on the ground. That's your logging contractors, your truckers, the issues that they face, the high investment without any guarantee that there's really going to be some ongoing supply and work there for them, those longer term contracts, and some consistent level of management needed on that end. We heard about fire borrowing and kind of robbing land management budgets. So the fire costs have increased, and over time that's eroded and taken money away from the land management side. And there's been efforts to fix that here. We've heard about litigation and some of the challenges, and I'll tie that to collaboration, because the issue of collaboration came up, and that is you have folks working at the local level to come together in agreement, and they spend years in that collaborative effort, putting forth that effort and commitment and agreeing on projects moving forward, goes through NEPA, and then the disconnect, as you heard at times, between local chapters and organizations and the national chapters, with no preference really in a sense given to the local chapters when those decisions or rulings are made by the judicial branch. So you have a kind of a disconnect there. With that comes frustration by the local collaboratives, burnout, and then there's another issue that wasn't mentioned here, but I've heard over the years, and at times that can be the change in staffing, right? When changes in staffing occur at the district ranger or forest soup level at times, just the continuity of that collaborative effort can be disrupted. So that's another issue that's related to collaboration. We have also heard the issues that come along with just the vacancies at times. We've heard that here today. There's vacancies that are not being filled, and I heard the implementation capacity to be able to get that work done on the ground. So you've heard a variety of issues. One of the questions from the audience was about threatened and endangered species, right? And the effect that a ruling could have on with lynx. What can that have on the management? But it's not just lynx, it's all threatened and endangered species. Whether you're talking about fish species or you're talking about grizzly bear, lynx, caribou, you name it, here in Idaho, it could be a variety of T&E species issues that impact the level of management. The other thing I think that I think folks take for granted, or we all assume and we know, and maybe wasn't articulated here at times, is the conflicting patchwork of laws that our federal partners are asked to operate under, in a sense. And that becomes very challenging at times trying to get work done. And so you heard a variety of challenges. The panel today was meant to set, kind of give you an idea of the kind of challenges that we face here in Idaho. As I mentioned earlier, some of the other panels will talk about some of the tools we're using to help move the needle. But here's what I'll say in relationship to all of this, and that it is going to take all of us working together to really increase the pace and scale on a significant level to address what's facing us here. It's going to take all of us working together, not focusing on our differences, because that's really easy to do, and we've been there. We know that that doesn't work, but we're going to have to figure out how to work together to be open and honest with each other and to problem solve and find solutions. And that's what we're hoping to do throughout the next couple of days here, is to talk about, knowing that we have these challenges, what are the possible solutions if we work together to address the needs of the landscape out there, because it affects us, every one of us. So with that, thank you.